The world believed Lady Seraphina Beaumont was living a fairy tale. Betrothed to the handsome and influential Lord Alistair Finch, her wedding day was meant to be the envy of the London season. But behind the veil of white lace, her reality was a gilded cage, and the man waiting at the altar was her jailer. On the morning she was to say, "I do," she made a different vow, to be free. With nothing but a stolen horse and a desperate prayer, she fled into a raging tempest, trading a life of certain misery for a future of utter uncertainty. She never imagined that crashing, quite literally, into a world of shadow and stone would lead her to him. The one man more broken, more barricaded, and more forbidden than the life she had just escaped. The scent of lilies was suffocating. It clung to the heavy damask curtains, the polished mahogany of the furniture, and the very air in Lady Seraphina Beaumont's chambers. It was the chosen flower for her wedding bouquet, and she had come to despise it. Today, the 11th of May, 1817, was the day her life was to be signed away, notarized by the Archbishop and witnessed by the cream of London society. From her window, she could see the procession of carriages already clogging the Mayfair street. Each one deposited another guest adorned in silks and jewels, their faces alight with the pleasant, detached excitement of a grand social event. They saw a fairy tale union, the beautiful, gentle daughter of the Earl of Northwood, marrying the formidable Lord Alistair Finch, a man whose political star was rising as fast as his fortune. Seraphina saw only the bars of her cage being gilded. She smoothed the front of her ivory silk gown, the material cool and heavy against her trembling skin. It was a masterpiece of French design, with a delicate lace overlay and seed pearls sewn into the bodice in the shape of, ironically, swooping doves. A gift from Finch. Every part of this day was a gift from him, and each one felt like a shackle. "You look ethereal, my dear," her father, the Earl, said, entering the room without knocking. His face, usually ruddy with brandy, was pale with a mixture of pride and anxiety. He was a man drowning in gambling debts, and Lord Finch was his lifeline. "Thank you, father," she murmured, her voice a hollow echo of its usual self. "Finch is a good man, Seraphina, a strong man. He will take care of you. He will take care of us." The last part was said with a pointed look that twisted a knife in her gut. She was not a bride. She was a transaction. A beautiful, well-bred commodity to be traded for the Beaumont family's solvency. She had tried to protest months ago when the betrothal was first announced. She had spoken of Finch's coldness, the possessive gleam in his eyes when he looked at her, the way his fingers would grip her arm just a fraction too tightly, a silent promise of ownership. Her father had dismissed it as girlish fantasy. Her mother, long worn down by a loveless marriage of her own, had simply advised her to find her joys in other things, in household management, in charity, in producing an heir. The final, horrifying confirmation of Finch's character had come just last week. Her lady's maid, the sweet and timid Clara, had accidentally spilled a drop of tea on his riding gloves. Seraphina had watched, frozen, as Finch's charming facade had vanished. He hadn't struck the girl, but the low, venomous threat he'd whispered in her ear had made Clara weep silently for an hour. It was a glimpse of the man who would be her husband, the man who would have absolute power over her in the privacy of their home. That was the moment her desperate idea had solidified into a concrete plan. "It is time," her father said, offering his arm. Seraphina took a deep breath, the lilies choking her. She looked at her reflection in the grand, gilt-edged mirror. The woman staring back was a pale, frightened stranger. But deep in her eyes, a spark of defiance flickered. She had spent the last week using her pin money to bribe a young stable hand, Thomas, a boy with a sick mother who needed the coin. A fresh horse, not the family's best, but a sturdy one, was to be saddled and waiting by the old postern gate at the back of the gardens. A small satchel containing a change of clothes, a few pieces of jewellery she could sell, and a loaf of bread was already hidden in the saddlebag. She allowed her father to lead her from the room. They walked down the grand staircase, the marble cool beneath her silk slippers. The sound of the string quartet in the foyer grew louder. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the serene melody. I feel a little faint, father, she said, her hand flying to her temple. The corset, it is dreadfully tight. May I have a moment in the morning room for some air? Her father frowned, impatient. Serafina, do not make a scene. It will only be a moment. Please, she begged, allowing her knees to buckle slightly. I would rather not swoon at the altar. The thought of such a public embarrassment horrified him more than her discomfort. Very well, but be quick. Finch is not a patient man. He guided her into the small, sunlit morning room and left, closing the doors behind him. This was it. Her one chance. The room had French doors that opened directly into the gardens. Her hand shook so violently she could barely work the latch. With a small click, it opened. She didn't hesitate. Hoisting the heavy silk of her skirts, she ran. She ran past her mother's prize-winning roses, their thorns snagging the delicate lace of her wedding gown. She ran past the ornamental fountain where she'd played as a child. The pristine white hem of her dress was stained with mud and grass. She didn't care. She reached the postern gate. As promised, Thomas was there, holding the reins of a nervous-looking bay mare. "My lady," he whispered, his eyes wide with fear and awe. "Thank you, Thomas. May God bless you," she said, pressing the last of her coins into his hand. He gave her a clumsy leg up, her wedding dress tangling around her legs. She settled into the saddle, a position she was familiar with, but never in such cumbersome attire. She glanced back one last time at the grand house, at the life she was leaving behind. A life of luxury and misery. Then she turned and rode, urging the horse into a canter, away from the suffocating lilies, away from the gilded cage, and into the teeth of a gathering storm that mirrored the one in her own soul. The heavens opened not with a gentle spring shower, but with a furious, biblical deluge. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the country lane into a treacherous river of mud. The wind howled, a mournful cry that tore at the branches of the ancient oaks lining the road. Serafina's elegant wedding attire was now a sodden, heavy weight, plastered to her skin and chilling her to the bone. Her elaborate coiffure had collapsed, sending tendrils of dark hair whipping across her face, stinging her eyes. She had been riding for hours, guided only by a desperate instinct to put as much distance as possible between herself and London. Her plan, such as it was, had been to reach the Great North Road and travel to a small coastal town where she might find passage on a ship, perhaps to France, or even America. But the storm had disoriented her, and the sturdy bay mare, now exhausted and spooked, was beginning to stumble. A brilliant fork of lightning illuminated the sky, followed an instant later by a deafening crack of thunder. The mare reared in terror, whinnying wildly. Serafina, an accomplished rider but unprepared for such a violent reaction, lost her grip on the slippery reins. She was thrown from the saddle, landing with a sickening thud in the thick, grasping mud of the roadside ditch. For a moment, she lay stunned, the breath knocked from her lungs. The horse, free of its rider, bolted into the gloom. Pain, sharp and searing, shot through her left ankle. She tried to push herself up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her. She was alone, injured, and soaked through in the middle of a tempest, miles from anywhere she knew. Despair, cold and sharp, began to pierce the adrenaline that had fueled her flight. She managed to crawl out of the ditch, her beautiful gown now ripped and caked in filth. She tried to put weight on her ankle and cried out, collapsing back against the muddy bank. It was hopeless. Finch's men would find her. They would drag her back in disgrace, and her punishment would be a life sentence served in his cold, cruel company. Tears of frustration and fear mingled with the relentless rain on her cheeks. It was then she heard it, a sound distinct from the storm, the rhythmic, powerful beat of a horse's hooves, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. A figure emerged from the deluge, a silhouette of black against the grey world. A massive black stallion, its eyes wild, but its gait controlled, and a rider who seemed to be a part of the storm itself. He was cloaked and hatted, but she could see he was a man of considerable size, his posture radiating an aura of absolute command. He reined in his horse a few feet from her, looking down from his great height. Seraphina shrank back, her heart leaping into her throat. Was it one of Finch's men? The rider dismounted, with a fluid grace that belied his size. He took a step closer, and the lightning flashed again, illuminating his face for a stark, breathtaking moment. It was a face carved from granite and shadow, sharp, aristocratic cheekbones, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and a mouth that looked as if it had never known how to smile. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a startling, piercing grey, the colour of the storm clouds above, and they were filled with a profound, weary cynicism. This was not one of Finch's fawning cronies. This was someone far more dangerous. "You are a long way from a church," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that cut through the wind's howl. He took in her appearance, the ruined white dress, the mud, the shivering, with a cool, analytical gaze that offered no pity. I'm lost," Seraphina stammered, clutching her torn skirts. "My horse threw me." "So I see," he replied, his tone flat. He made no move to help her. "This is private land. You are trespassing." The sheer arrogance of the man, to speak of trespassing to a woman clearly in distress, ignited a spark of her fading defiance. "I assure you, it was not my intention to grace your precious land with my unfortunate presence. I am injured and in need of assistance." A flicker of something, was it surprise, amusement, crossed his features before being extinguished. Assistance is not something readily offered in these parts, especially to half-drowned brides who appear to be fleeing rather than processing. He knew. The white dress was a clear advertisement of her situation. She felt a flush of shame heat her cold skin. "My situation is none of your concern," she retorted, trying to push herself up again, only to hiss in pain as her ankle protested. He watched her struggle for a moment longer, his grey eyes unreadable. She thought he might simply turn, mount his horse, and ride away, leaving her to the mercy of the elements. The thought was terrifying. Instead, with a sigh that sounded more like an expression of profound irritation than compassion, he strode forward. Without a word of warning, he bent down and swept her up into his arms. She gave a startled cry, both at the suddenness of the action and the sheer strength of him. He held her as if she weighed nothing, his cloak wrapping around her, smelling of rain, leather, and damp earth. "Do not mistake this for chivalry," he rumbled, his face close to hers. "My stables are warmer than this ditch, and I've no desire to find a woman's corpse on my property come morning. It is a matter of convenience." He carried her to his stallion, mounting with an ease that was astonishing, and settled her in front of him. Her back was pressed against his hard chest, and she could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart. It was the calmest thing in the whole storm-tossed world. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her voice small. He urged the great horse forward into the gloom. "To Blackwood Manor," he said, and the name seemed to be torn from the very throat of the storm. "And I assure you, madam, you will wish you had taken your chances with the rain." Blackwood Manor was not a house. It was a fortress of sorrow. It rose from the moors like a jagged tooth of granite, its mullioned windows dark and watchful eyes against the storm. As they passed through a set of immense, creaking wrought-iron gates, Seraphina felt a chill that had nothing to do with her damp clothes. This place was the architectural embodiment of the man who now held her captive. He carried her through a massive oak door into a great hall that swallowed the light and sound. A fire roared in a cavernous hearth, but it did little to dispel the gloom or the cold that seemed to seep from the very stones. A stout, grey-haired woman in a housekeeper's uniform bustled forward, her face a mask of concern. "Your Grace, you are soaked to the bone!" And, "Oh, my heavens!" Her eyes landed on the bedraggled, mud-caked creature in his arms. "Your Grace." The words landed in Seraphina's mind with the weight of a stone. She was in the clutches of a duke. "See to her, Mrs. Gable," the Duke commanded, his voice echoing in the vaulted space. He deposited Seraphina into a large wing-back chair near the fire with a distinct lack of ceremony. "She has an injured ankle. Find her something dry to wear and send for Dr. Evans." "Of course, Your Grace." The Duke, Alaric Thorne, the infamous and reclusive Duke of Blackwood, as she would soon learn, stood for a moment, dripping onto the flagstones, his piercing grey eyes fixed on her. He seemed to be assessing her as one might assess a stray animal that had wandered indoors, a nuisance to be dealt with. Then, without another word, he turned and ascended the grand, shadowy staircase, disappearing into the upper gloom. "Come now, dearie," Mrs. Gable said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Let's get you out of these wet things before you catch your death." The housekeeper, with the help of a young, wide-eyed maid, helped Seraphina to a guest chamber. It was a large, imposing room, dominated by a heavy, dark wood four-poster bed. Like the rest of the manor, it was clean but felt unused, unloved. They helped her out of the ruined wedding gown, which was cut away with shears, an unceremonious end to a £600 dress. Soaking in a hot bath that Mrs. Gable drew for her, Seraphina felt the bone-deep chill finally begin to recede, though the fear remained. Dr. Evans arrived an hour later, a kind elderly man with spectacles perched on his nose. He confirmed her ankle was badly sprained, not broken, and bound it tightly, prescribing rest. Over the next few days, Seraphina was a prisoner in the oppressive quiet of Blackwood Manor. The storm outside eventually passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and green. But inside the house, the atmosphere remained one of perpetual twilight. She saw the Duke only fleetingly. He was a phantom in his own home, a tall, dark figure crossing the far end of a corridor, or the sound of a closing door from the wing of the house she was told was his private domain. He took his meals alone. He spoke to no one but his staff, and even then, in clipped, necessary tones. Confined to her room and the adjacent sitting room, Seraphina felt her defiance give way to a listless boredom. It was Mrs. Gable who, seeing the spark dimming in the young lady's eyes, suggested the library. "His Grace never uses it," the housekeeper confided. "Hasn't set foot in there in years. It was his father's pride and joy." The library was a revelation. It was 2 stories high, with towering shelves of books reaching to a coffered ceiling. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and the air was heavy with the scent of old paper, and decaying leather. But to Seraphina, it was paradise. She hobbled through the aisles, her bandaged ankle aching, her fingers trailing over the spines of forgotten volumes. Here were books on botany, her secret passion, treatises on philosophy, poetry by Byron and Keats, travelogues of distant lands. It was a treasure trove of minds and worlds beyond her own constricted experience. She began spending her days there, cleaning the books herself with a soft cloth, organizing them, losing herself in their pages. She would sit in a dusty shaft of sunlight, her ankle propped on a stool, and for hours she would forget she was a runaway bride in a recluse's castle. One afternoon, lost in a detailed botanical illustration of a wild orchid, she didn't hear him enter. "The Dactylorhiza purpurella," his deep voice said from the doorway. "The northern marsh orchid. It grows on the moors here, but only in the bogs. It is notoriously difficult to cultivate." Seraphina jumped, startled. The Duke stood there, watching her. He was dressed not in formal ducal attire, but in simple, well-tailored riding breeches and a linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. "Your Grace," she said, instinctively closing the book. "Do not let me interrupt your cataloguing," he said, a faint, almost undetectable note of irony in his voice. He walked further into the room, his gaze sweeping over the shelves. "You have been busy." "The books deserved better than to be left to rot," she said, her defensiveness rising. "A book is merely paper and ink. Its fate is of little consequence." "How can you say that?" she countered, forgetting her station. "A book is a voice from the past, a window to another world. It is a thing of magic." He stopped and turned to look at her fully. For the first time, his gaze was not one of cool dismissal, but of genuine, sharp-eyed assessment. "A romantic notion. But windows can show you falsehoods, and magic is for children's stories." "And what is left for adults, Your Grace? Only cynicism and stone walls?" The words were out before she could stop them. A muscle tightened in his jaw. He walked over to the window and looked out at the wild, untamed gardens. Stone walls have the virtue of being honest. They do not pretend to be anything other than a barrier. They keep the world out, and they keep the darkness in. There was a profound sadness in his words that took her by surprise. This man was not just cold, he was wounded, deeply. An awkward silence fell between them, filled only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. "The gardens," Seraphina said softly, gesturing towards the window. "I saw them from my room. They are overgrown, but the layout is beautiful. I saw what I believe is a Rosa gallica near the south wall, a true apothecary rose. It's being choked by weeds." He turned back from the window, his expression unreadable. "My mother designed those gardens. After she died, my father let them go. I have merely continued the tradition of neglect." He was sharing a piece of his history, a small, splintered piece. It was the first crack she had seen in his granite facade. He looked at her, then at the book on her lap, a silent conversation passing between them. He, the master of a decaying legacy, and she, the runaway who found solace in reviving forgotten things. For a fleeting moment in the dusty, sunlit library, the stone fortress of Blackwood Manor felt a little less like a prison. The fragile truce forged in the library did not last. The Duke, Alaric, retreated once more into his shadows, and the brief moment of connection felt like a dream. Seraphina continued her quiet existence, dividing her time between the library and tentative explorations of the overgrown gardens as her ankle healed. She found the apothecary rose and spent an afternoon carefully clearing the weeds from its base, her hands getting scratched and dirty. There was a simple satisfaction in the work, a feeling of nurturing something back to life that resonated with her own fragile hopes. One evening, as Mrs. Gable helped her change the dressing on her ankle, the housekeeper grew talkative. "It is good to see some life in this house again, my lady," she said, her movements efficient and gentle. "And in him. His Grace seems to prefer his solitude," Seraphina replied carefully. Mrs. Gable sighed, a sad, weary sound. "It was not always so. Before Lady Isabella." The name hung in the air. Seraphina remained silent, inviting the housekeeper to continue. "She was his first love. A beauty, from a good family, but with a grasping heart. He was a second son then, not expected to inherit. His older brother, George, was the heir. Alaric was just a captain in the army, full of life and laughter. He adored Lady Isabella, would have given her the world. But the world wasn't enough. She wanted a title. She broke his heart for a wealthier man, the Marquess of Flint. 2 months after she married the Marquess, a letter arrived for Captain Thorne. It was from her. She claimed she had made a terrible mistake, that she loved only him. The housekeeper's voice dropped to a whisper. He went to her. He was going to ask her to run away with him, to hell with society and titles. But he was too late. There had been a terrible argument with her new husband. She fell from a balcony. Some say she jumped. Some say she was pushed. The scandal was horrific. Then, a week later, his brother George took a fever and died. Suddenly, Captain Thorne was the Duke of Blackwood. He inherited the title, the fortune, all the things she had wanted. The irony destroyed him. He believes all love is a transaction, all affection a mask for avarice. The story settled over Seraphina like a shroud. It explained everything: the cynicism, the stone walls, the retreat from the world. He wasn't born a monster. He had been meticulously crafted by betrayal and grief. A few days later, the outside world intruded. A rider arrived with the London Post. Usually this was a matter of no concern to Seraphina, but this time the Duke summoned her to his study. It was the first time she had been in the room. It was stark and masculine, dominated by a massive desk and shelves filled with ledgers rather than novels. The air smelled of brandy and old paper. Alaric stood by the window, his back to her. A copy of the London Chronicle was open on his desk. Even from a distance, Seraphina could see the headline: "Beaumont bride vanishes. Earl's daughter flees wedding to Lord Finch. Foul play suspected?" Her blood ran cold. "It seems you are quite the celebrity, madam," Alaric said, turning around slowly. His face was a thundercloud, his grey eyes glacial. He was holding a letter. "I have also received a personal correspondence from an acquaintance in Parliament. He writes at length about the scandal, about how the heartbroken Lord Finch has offered a substantial reward for any information leading to your safe return. How he fears you were taken, your mind, perhaps, unbalanced by maidenly nerves." He took a menacing step closer. But he also mentions another, more pertinent detail. He mentions that the Beaumont family is financially ruined, that your marriage to Finch, a man of new but immense wealth, was the only thing standing between your father and debtor's prison. He stopped in front of her, so close she could see the flecks of silver in his stormy eyes. "So tell me, Lady Seraphina," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Was it a broken heart you were fleeing? Or were you simply looking for a wealthier cage?" The accusation struck her with the force of a physical blow. After everything, after the flicker of understanding in the library, he saw her only through the poisoned lens of his past. He saw Isabella. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a rage that eclipsed her fear. "Oh, I dare," he shot back. It is a clever plan, I admit. Flee into the wilderness, conveniently injure yourself on the doorstep of a reclusive, ridiculously wealthy duke. Play the part of the gentle, misunderstood maiden. How long did you intend to stay before you began making your demands? A month? 2? Tears of fury and hurt stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She lifted her chin, meeting his icy gaze with a fire of her own. You see wickedness in others because it is all you have in yourself, Your Grace, she said, her voice clear and cold. You hide in this mausoleum, nursing your ancient wounds and assuming every woman is a carbon copy of the one who broke your heart. You are not wise or discerning. You are a coward. His face hardened into an emotionless mask, but she saw a flicker of shock in his eyes. No one had spoken to him like this for years. I will not stay another moment under the roof of a man who holds me in such contempt, she declared. My ankle is strong enough to walk. I will take my leave now. You will go nowhere, he commanded. The roads are not safe, and Lord Finch's men are likely scouring the countryside. I would rather face a dozen of Finch's henchmen than spend another second in the presence of your suffocating prejudice. She turned on her heel, ignoring the pain in her ankle, and stormed out of the study, slamming the heavy oak door behind her. The sound echoed through the silent, cavernous house, a declaration of war. In his study, Alaric Thorne stood motionless, the letter crinkling in his white-knuckled fist. Her words, "You are a coward," rang in his ears, a more direct hit than any enemy's blade had ever managed. Seraphina spent the night in a state of furious, sleepless agitation. She packed her small satchel, her hands trembling. The borrowed dress Mrs. Gable had given her, a simple grey wool, felt more like her own skin than the silks she had left behind. She had no money and no clear destination, but the thought of staying at Blackwood Manor, of seeing the Duke's accusing eyes again, was unbearable. Before dawn, she crept down the servants' staircase, her heart pounding. Her plan was to make for the kitchens, take a loaf of bread, and slip out through a back door. The main hall was dark and silent, but as she passed the Duke's study, she saw a sliver of light from beneath the door. A deep, masculine sob, choked off as quickly as it had begun, reached her ears. She froze. The sound was so full of anguish, so utterly broken, it momentarily shattered her anger. It was the sound of a man drowning in his own grief. She pictured him in there alone, the coward she had called him, wrestling with ghosts she had so carelessly provoked. Her resolve wavered. Turning away, she continued to the kitchen, but the sound haunted her steps. In the grey light of dawn, she was making her way across the misty lawns towards the gate when a figure intercepted her. It was Mrs. Gable, a heavy shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "Running away again, my lady?" the housekeeper asked, her tone gentle but firm. "It is becoming a habit." "I cannot stay here," Seraphina said, her voice thick with emotion. "Because he is a blind, stubborn fool?" Mrs. Gable stated plainly. "Aye, that he is. But he is not a monster. He is a man in pain, and you, my lady, are the first person in a decade to make him feel anything other than that pain, even if it is anger." Just then, another sound broke the morning quiet, the frantic ringing of the estate's front bell, pulled with an alarming urgency. Both women turned. A moment later, a stable boy came running from the house. "Mrs. Gable, it's a lass! Clara, she says her name is. From London. Says she has an urgent message for Lady Seraphina." Seraphina's blood turned to ice. Clara, her lady's maid. How had she found her? They rushed back to the house. In the great hall, soaked and exhausted from what must have been a harrowing journey, was Clara. The moment she saw Seraphina, she burst into tears and threw her arms around her. "Oh, my lady, I was so worried. He's a beast, a devil," she sobbed. At that moment, the Duke emerged from his study, his face pale and drawn. He took in the scene, his eyes locking on Seraphina. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "My lady's maid, your grace," Seraphina explained, her arm around the weeping girl. "Clara, what happened? How did you get here?" Clara, between hiccuping sobs, told her story. After Seraphina's escape, Lord Finch had been in a rage. He had interrogated the entire staff, and his suspicion had fallen on Clara. He'd locked her in her room, threatening her, telling her in gruesome detail what he would do to Seraphina when he found her. His obsession was terrifying. He didn't speak of love or honor, but of possession, of breaking her will. Fearing for Seraphina's life, Clara had escaped through a window, using her meager savings to hire a carriage to take her north, guessing Seraphina's general direction. She had spent 2 days asking at coaching inns if anyone had seen a lady in a wedding dress. "He is not just looking for you, my lady," Clara whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "He has hired men. Not constables, but ruffians from the docks. He said he wants you brought back, by any means necessary. He said the world will think it a kidnapping by scoundrels, and he will be the hero who rescues you." The calculated cruelty of the plan was chilling. Finch intended to terrorize her into submission, ensuring she was too broken and shamed to ever defy him again. Alaric had listened to the entire story in stony silence. The raw, terrified testimony of the young maid was more convincing than any denial Seraphina could have offered. It painted a portrait of a villainy that even his cynical mind had not fully fathomed. He looked at Seraphina, at her proud, terrified face, and saw not a scheming fortune hunter, but a woman who had run for her life. His accusation from the day before felt like ash in his mouth. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice quiet, but filled with a new authority. "Take Clara to the kitchens. Give her a hot meal and a warm, dry place to rest." He waited until the women had gone. The hall was silent again, save for the crackling of the fire. He turned to Seraphina, and for the first time, the icy mask was gone. In its place was a deep, profound shame. "Lady Seraphina," he began, his voice rough, "the words I spoke to you yesterday, they were born of a bitterness that has nothing to do with you. They were unjust, and they were cruel. I offer you my most sincere and unconditional apology." It was more than an apology. It was a confession, an admission that his fortress had been breached. Seraphina looked at the formidable Duke, at the pain and regret etched on his face, and her anger melted away, replaced by a complex wave of empathy. "Your apology is accepted, Your Grace," she said softly. "Alaric," he corrected her. "My name is Alaric." "Seraphina," she replied. An understanding passed between them. They were no longer jailer and prisoner, or cynic and schemer. They were two people, marked by their pasts, facing a common enemy. "He will not find you here," Alaric said, his voice hardening with resolve. "He will not touch you. I will post men at the gates. This house, which has been my refuge, will now be yours. I give you my word. You are safe at Blackwood Manor." It was a vow, and looking into his storm-grey eyes, Seraphina Beaumont, the runaway bride, believed him. For the first time since she had fled the suffocating scent of lilies, she felt a flicker, not just of safety, but of hope. The days that followed Alaric's vow transformed the atmosphere at Blackwood Manor. The house, while still quiet, was no longer filled with oppressive silence, but with a purposeful tension. Alaric was a man of action, a former military captain roused from a long slumber. He sent riders to his tenants, grim-faced men who had served under him in the war, and soon the estate was quietly patrolled by loyal guards. He was no longer a ghost in his own home. He was its commander. He and Serafina began to spend their evenings together in the library. He would read reports from his estate manager, and she would read her botanical texts. But the silence between them was now comfortable, companionable. They would talk, at first, about books and gardening, then about more personal matters. She told him of her love for drawing plants, a talent her father had dismissed as an unladylike hobby. He, in turn, spoke of his time in the Peninsular War, of the camaraderie he missed, of the burden of a title he had never wanted. He never spoke of Isabella, and she never asked, but the ghost was no longer a barrier between them. It was a shared, unspoken sorrow. One rainy afternoon, he found her in the neglected conservatory, a crumbling glass house at the back of the manor. She was sketching a rare, pale orchid that had somehow survived amidst the decay. "It is beautiful," he said, looking over her shoulder at her drawing. The detail was exquisite, a work of scientific precision and artistic grace. "You have a remarkable talent." "My father called it a waste of good paper," she murmured, not looking up. "Your father," Alaric said with a quiet intensity, "is a fool." His hand came to rest on her shoulder, a gesture of simple, unadorned comfort. She leaned into the touch almost imperceptibly, a silent acknowledgement of the bond growing between them. The air grew thick with unspoken words. He moved his hand to her cheek, his thumb gently tracing her jawline. His grey eyes were dark with an emotion she had never seen in them before, a raw, vulnerable longing that mirrored her own. He leaned in, and she closed her eyes, her heart hammering, her lips parting in anticipation. But the moment was shattered by a frantic shout from outside. "Riders approaching! The front gate!" Alaric straightened instantly, his face hardening back into a commander's mask. "Stay here," he ordered Serafina. "Bar the door." He strode from the conservatory without a backward glance. Serafina, her heart still racing, did as she was told, her mind reeling. She peered through the grimy glass, her view partially obscured, as a carriage and several outriders pulled up before the main entrance of the manor. Leading them, resplendent in a tailored riding coat of bottle green, was Lord Alastair Finch. He was not there to negotiate. Alaric met him on the steps, flanked by two of his largest groundskeepers. "Finch," Alaric said, his voice lethally calm, "you are trespassing." "Thorn," Finch sneered, his handsome face contorted with rage. "I have no business with you. I am here for my betrothed, Lady Serafina. She was abducted and is being held here against her will. Release her to me at once." "Lady Serafina is a guest in my home," Alaric replied, his voice like chipping ice. "And she is here of her own free will. Now, I suggest you leave my property before I have you removed." Finch laughed, a short, ugly sound. "A guest? Is that what you call it? Hiding my fiancée away in this dreary pile of rocks? I have a special license. She is mine by law. I am here to claim my property." The word property hung in the air, a vile pollutant. From the conservatory, Serafina felt a wave of nausea. "She is a woman, Finch, not a piece of furniture," Alaric growled, "and she will not be leaving with you." "We shall see about that," Finch screeched, his composure cracking. He gestured to the men he'd brought with him, the ruffians Clara had described. "Get her!" The brutes surged forward, but Alaric's men were ready. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Alaric, moving with the deadly efficiency of a seasoned soldier, disarmed one man with his walking stick and landed a precise, powerful punch that sent another staggering back. His groundskeepers were formidable opponents, used to hard labor and fiercely loyal. But Finch had another plan. While the brawl distracted everyone, he darted around the side of the house, towards the gardens, towards the conservatory. Serafina saw him coming, and her blood ran cold. She backed away from the door she had barred, searching frantically for a weapon. Her eyes landed on a heavy iron trowel, left behind by a long-forgotten gardener. She snatched it up, her hand shaking. Finch reached the conservatory door and slammed his shoulder against it. The old wood groaned. "Serafina, you little fool! Do you think this madman can protect you? I will have you. You will be my wife, and you will learn to obey." He hit the door again, and this time a panel splintered. Through the crack, she could see his wild, possessive eyes. This was not the charming lord from the London ballrooms. This was the monster she had always known was lurking beneath. Just as the door was about to give way, a figure appeared behind Finch. It was Alaric, his face a mask of cold fury, a thin trickle of blood running from a cut on his temple. "Get away from her," Alaric said, his voice dangerously low. Finch spun around, a snarl on his lips. He drew a small, ornate pistol from his coat. "She is mine. I will kill you before I let you have her." He aimed the pistol not at Alaric, but at the splintered door of the conservatory, at Serafina. Without hesitation, Alaric lunged, not to disarm Finch, but to slam him against the stone wall of the manor. The pistol discharged, the shot going wild and shattering a pane of glass high above. Alaric drove his forearm into Finch's throat, pinning him. "You will never touch her again," Alaric seethed, his face inches from Finch's. "You will not speak her name. You will renounce the betrothal. I have already sent word to my solicitors in London. By the time you return, your business partners will have learned of your unstable, violent nature. Your credit will be ruined. Your political allies will desert you. I will dismantle your entire world, piece by piece, until you have nothing. Now get off my land." He released Finch, who collapsed, choking and gasping. The fight had been knocked out of him, replaced by the dawning horror of utter ruin. His hired thugs had been subdued. Beaten and humiliated, Finch staggered back to his carriage, his face a mask of disbelief and hatred. As the carriage rattled away, Alaric turned to the conservatory. He wrenched open the broken door. Serafina stood in the middle of the room, still clutching the trowel, trembling but unharmed. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides and pulled her into his arms. She dropped the trowel with a clatter and buried her face in his chest, her body shaking with reaction. He held her tightly, his hand stroking her hair, whispering her name like a prayer. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "He's gone. You are safe." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. In that moment, surrounded by the scent of damp earth and shattered glass, she knew she had fled one cage only to find her true sanctuary in the arms of the Duke, who never believed in love. The stone walls of Blackwood had been breached, not by an enemy, but by a wild rose who had refused to let the weeds choke her. In the aftermath of the siege, a profound peace settled over Blackwood Manor. Lord Finch, true to Alaric's word, was systematically ruined. Whispers of his violent instability, strategically placed by Alaric's influential friends, spread through the ton like wildfire. His creditors called in their loans, and his political ambitions crumbled to dust. He vanished from London society, a disgraced and forgotten man. Serafina was finally, truly free. Her freedom, however, presented a new, more complicated dilemma. There was no longer any reason for her to stay at Blackwood. She could return to society, perhaps live with a sympathetic aunt in Bath, and try to piece together a life from the wreckage. Yet the thought of leaving the grey stone walls, the dusty library, and the wild, untamed gardens felt like another kind of exile. The thought of leaving Alaric was unbearable. He, too, seemed to be wrestling with a similar conflict. The crisis had broken down the last of his defenses, but he did not know how to live in the open. He was attentive and kind, but a shadow of uncertainty hung between them. The near kiss in the conservatory remained an unspoken, charged memory. He was the Duke who had saved her, her protector, her friend. But could he be more? Could a man so deeply scarred by the past ever truly embrace a future? One bright, crisp autumn afternoon, Seraphina was in the main garden, tending to the apothecary rose she had adopted. It was thriving under her care, a splash of defiant pink against the old grey stone. She heard his footsteps on the gravel path behind her. "It seems you have a gift for reviving things that others have left for dead," Alaric said, his voice soft. She stood and turned to face him, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. It only needed a little care. Its roots were still strong. He looked from the rose to her, and his grey eyes were filled with a lifetime of unspoken words. "Seraphina," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Finch is gone. You are free to go wherever you wish. My solicitor has made arrangements for a stipend to be paid to you, anonymously of course, to ensure your independence. You need never be reliant on your family or anyone again." Her heart sank. He was letting her go. He was giving her freedom, the very thing she had craved, but it felt like a sentence. "I see," she said, her voice quiet. "That is very generous of you, Alaric." "It is the least I can do," he said, jamming his hands into his pockets, looking anywhere but at her. "After everything." "And what of you?" she asked, her voice finding its strength. "Will you go back to your shadows? Will you let the weeds grow over everything once more, now that your duty is done?" He finally met her gaze, and she saw the raw turmoil in his eyes. "It is all I have known for 10 years. "That is a choice," she said gently. "Not a life sentence. You told me stone walls are honest, because they do not pretend. But they are also a prison, Alaric, one you built for yourself. You do not have to live inside it anymore." He took a step closer, his hands still clenched in his pockets, as if to restrain himself. "I do not know how to be anything else. The last time I cared for someone, it brought nothing but ruin and death." "Isabella, I am not Isabella," Seraphina interrupted, her voice firm but full of compassion. "I do not want your title or your fortune. I do not want a life in London society. I want the quiet of your library. I want dirt under my fingernails from your gardens. I want the man who quoted botanical names to a stranger and who stood on his steps to face down a monster for her sake." Tears welled in her eyes, and this time she let them fall. "I have fallen in love with you, Alaric Thorne, with the cynic and the soldier and the gardener. All of it. If you send me away, I will go. But know that you are sending away the only home I have ever truly found." The confession hung in the air between them, bright and fragile. He looked at her, truly looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time without the ghosts of his past clouding his vision. He saw not a transaction, not a liability, not a woman who would betray him, but Seraphina. His Seraphina. With a choked sound, he closed the distance between them, his hands finally coming free. He cupped her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "I have been in the dark for so long," he whispered, his voice thick with a decade of unshed emotion. "I had forgotten what sunlight felt like." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of polite romance, but a kiss of desperate, profound homecoming. It was the feel of rain after a long drought, the breaking of a fever, the end of a war. It was the promise that the gardens of Blackwood Manor would not be left to weeds, that its silent halls would be filled with laughter, and that its stone walls would no longer be a prison, but the foundations of a home. "Stay," he murmured against her lips. "Stay and be the mistress of this broken-down castle. Be my duchess. Be my wife. Seraphina, help me bring the roses back to life." "Yes," she whispered, her heart soaring. "Oh, yes." And in the autumn sunlight, surrounded by the wild, tenacious beauty of the garden, the runaway bride and the reclusive duke finally found where they were meant to be, together. And so, the story of Lady Seraphina and Duke Alaric comes not to an end, but to a new beginning. Theirs is a tale that reminds us that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not facing a public enemy, but confronting the private ghosts that haunt our own hearts. It proves that love isn't always a fairy tale found in a gilded ballroom, but a resilient wild flower that can bloom in the most broken of places. It shows us that even the most fortified walls can be brought down by a love that is honest, patient, and brave enough to see the person hiding behind them. If their journey from desperation to devotion touched your heart, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it, and share this story with someone else who loves a tale of romance against all odds. And most importantly, if you want more stories that sweep you away to another time and place, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support allows us to keep bringing these histories and heartbeats to life. Thank you for listening.